With the end of the Russian Civil War, Anton Denikin and Pyotr Wrangel had cemented themselves in the history books as liberators. Wrangel's notion of the Moscow Directive failing was a mere misconception. But with the fall of the Bolsheviks, what happens now? We discussed in Part 1 how Russia would look if Alexander Kolchak had ruled the country, but now we dive into an alternate history of Russia ruled by Anton Denikin. I explained who Anton Denikin was and his views on the war, but a brief recap is that he was a monarchist who ruled over South Russia, and in our timeline, he led the Moscow Directive, which failed. But with some good communication and more support from the Anton Denikin and his troops, captured Moscow by the beginning of 1920. The provisional government of Russia would be led by Kolchak until a real government would be established, in which that's where Denikin's comes in. The support of Alexander Kolchak at this time would have been lackluster to say the least. Not only had he not ended the war, but foreign relations with his top supporters such as the British and Americans were souring. In 1918, when Alexander Kolchak was head of the Siberian government, the British sponsored a coup against him. And in 1917, Alexander Kerensky banished him from Russia for fears of him being an extremist plot to overthrow the government. Suffice to say, support was wavering for Denikin. There are more things to say about how the Entente could, in theory, pop up a Denikin government and how it could look like, but tension with the Entente could see a lack of support for the provisional government, and civil unrest breaking down once again in 1922. The overwhelming pressure from Kolchak to reform the already shattering government would lead him to resign at the advice of the British. If not, a coup would occur. Either way, liberals and socialists alike would rebel and form a rival government, most likely in Omsk, where Georgy Lvov would most likely lead. American forces would continue to occupy Vladivostok, whereas the Japanese would jump at the chance to seize land in the Far East. The Second Russian Civil War had started. British troops in Murmansk and in Arkhangelsk would move towards the Urals, while in the Caucasus, British troops would also enter through Armenia, also to the Urals, while the Don Cossack army and the Volunteer Army would push through the middle. The rebels would be in a chokehold with no supporters. The war would end with a Denikin victory. But remnants would still linger in the east and in unstable regions of the former empire. With Anton Denikin in charge, he would act as the supreme ruler of Russia and enact policies that were originally supposed to be ended by the revolution. These include the diminishing of the autonomy of minorities, establish the aristocracy and land reforms be written to be given back to the aristocracy, and many other unpopular laws. This would likely cause rebellion in these areas with less control, especially in the east with Ikituya, which would most likely be sponsored by the Japanese. Although Pyotr Wrangel was strongly against these laws, he would not have much power to change them. As stated before, Anton Denikin was a monarchist, but with the deaths of the Romanovs, there are many people to choose from, which I'll give a brief overview of. Grand Duke Kirill was the first cousin of Nicholas II. He commanded the Russian Imperial Navy, and during the February Revolution, he declared his allegiance to the provisional government, but later fled to the UK, where he declared himself Emperor of the Russian people. Legally, he was the heir to the Russian throne, but Grand Duke Nicholas disputed this. I'll cover him a bit. In 1926, when Nicholas died, his supporters turned to Kirill, where the white émigré vastly supported him. Some weird things about Kirill were his views on the Soviets, and he, for one, even supported communism and the style of the Soviet government. His slogan was, "Tsar and the Soviets." Next is Grand Duke Nicholas, who was also the first cousin of Nicholas II. He replaced him as commander-in-chief of the Russian Imperial Army, where he was mostly unsuccessful. After the war, he fled to Italy, where he set up many anti-Soviet political groups and militant groups to infiltrate the Soviet Union. Also, something interesting was that he was married to Princess Anastasia of Montenegro, and brother-in-law to Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. Suffice to say, he had friends in the best places. Now here's another guy who could possibly be a pretender to the throne. Kinda unlikely, but, who cares? But George, Count Brazov, who is the son of Grand Duke Michael, so he's the nephew of Nicholas II. He didn't really have that much of a following and just lived in France, where he died at the young age of 20. Grand Duchess Xenia was a sister to Nicholas II and didn't really do much, to be honest. She helped widows of sailors and funded charities for tuberculosis patients. She escaped Russia during the Civil War by boarding from Crimea to the UK. Grand Duchess Olga was also a sister to Nicholas II, and also was pretty boring in terms of politics. There are other things to say about her, since her life is more dramatic than the collapse of the Russian Empire, but she was, for the most part, like her sister.
Go on.
So, just sit back and relax, my lord, because it's time for you to meet today's eligible bachelorettes. And here they are. Bachelorette number 1 is a mentally abused shut-in from a kingdom far, far away. She likes sushi and hot tubbing anytime. Her hobbies include cooking and cleaning for her 2 evil sisters. Please welcome
Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich.
Bachelorette number 2 is a cape-wearing girl from the land of fancy. Although she lives with 7 other men, she's not easy. Just kiss her dead, frozen lips and find out what a live wire she is. Come on, give it up for
Princess Xenia.
Last, but certainly not least, Bachelorette number 3 is a fiery redhead from a dragon-guarded castle surrounded by hot, boiling lava. But don't let that cool you off. She's a loaded pistol who likes pina coladas and getting caught in the rain. Yours for the rescuing,
Kirill Vladimirovich.
So, will it be Bachelorette number 1, Bachelorette number 2, or Bachelorette number 3?
Pick number 3, my lord.
Now let's take a little break to focus on something else. Rise of the Mongolian and Japanese Empire. Japan. At this time period, the Japanese Empire was a sleeping dragon that had just woken up. In 1914, Japan declared war on Germany and occupied German New Guinea, German Samoa, and the
Kiaochu.
Baileys territory, which was later given back to the Republic of China. In our timeline, Woodrow Wilson told the Japanese Prime Minister
Masatake Terauchi.
to send some troops into Siberia alongside American ones. He agreed and sent 12,000 troops. Fears of communism were also high in the Japanese public, and some politicians even called for direct annexation of parts of Siberia, but this never occurred. In the late stages of the Civil War, Japan continued to support white generals and resistance, but around the 1930s, the Japanese normalized relations. But with the end of the Civil War and a white victory, and then a second Civil War, Prime Minister would possibly now resign as the 1918 rice riots would not occur. Mongolia. Mongolia used to be ruled by the Qing dynasty, but in 1912, when the empire collapsed, Mongolia broke away and made their own government, ruled by a Tibetan monk named Bogd Khan. The Russian Empire initially supported the independence of Mongolia, but with the Civil War, they had other problems to deal with. So the Republic of China invaded and occupied it in our timeline. Then in 1921, some crazy white Russian general, who thought he was a reincarnation of Genghis Khan, invaded Mongolia and restored the Bogdan. Now, with the changes in his timeline, it's possible that instead of the Chinese invaded, it would be that General Samoyov I talked about earlier, annexing it, with the support of the Japanese, or Baron Ungern. That crazy dude could still arrive and create a Neo-Mongolian empire, but either way, Mongolia would still be a strong regional power. This alternate timeline is already blurring the lines between could have and fan fiction. But at this point, there's no stopping because I already know this video is going to have at least 500 views, obviously. With Anton Denikin being the head of state of Russia, his views would drastically change the countries around him. Armenia, for example, could be bigger in this timeline, as Anton Denikin has supported them during the Russian Civil War. Countries such as the Don Republic and the Cuban People's Republic would most likely turn into a puppet state or be outright annexed. But the new Tsar would also have an impact as being a socialist sympathizer. Nicholas would see a rise in socialism. And with the views of Denikin, Russia may be the first fascist country. This is where I'll end the video, now. And I know it's kind of dumb, but if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them in the comments. From everyone at Syrup Talk Studios.